The cardboard box was in the floodwaters, and floodwaters didn't care what was inside it. A sanctuary worker burst through the clinic doors soaked to the bone, cradling something small and limp against his chest. The storm had swallowed 3 miles of riverbank in under an hour, and this tiny creature had come with it. A Bengal tiger cub, no more than 4 days old, barely breathing. Every heat lamp was occupied, every incubator full. The staff scrambled, and for one terrifying moment, nobody knew how to keep him alive through the night. Then something moved at the edge of the room. A 10-pound apricot poodle named Penny pushed past the boots in the chaos, her soft curls damp from the rain-soaked air. She didn't bark. She didn't flinch. She walked straight up to the shivering cub, pressed her small black nose against his forehead, and curled her warm body around him like she'd been waiting her whole life for exactly this moment. The staff went silent. Nobody told Penny that tigers eat dogs. Nobody told her he was a predator, or that one day he'd weigh 500 pounds, or that the world had very specific rules about who gets to love whom. She didn't care. He was cold, he was alone, and she was his mother now. What happened next would change both of their lives, and break your heart wide open. If you've ever loved someone fiercely, regardless of what the world said made sense, then Penny's story is your story too. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the wild Samaritan family, because we find the animals the world overlooked, and we tell the stories that remind us why love still wins. And don't you dare click away yet, because what Raja does when he sees Penny again after years apart. Nobody in that containment barn was prepared for it. Stay with us. You need to see this. Nobody warned the staff that Penny would be possessive. By the second morning, she had claimed the corner of the clinic where Raja's warming blanket sat, and anyone who stepped too close got a growl that sounded far too serious for a 10-pound dog. Dr. Vanessa, the sanctuary's head veterinarian, learned this the hard way when she reached down to check the cub's temperature and found 12 pounds of apricot fury planting herself between the needle and the patient. "She's running triage," one of the volunteers whispered. Nobody laughed because it wasn't really a joke. Penny cleaned him the way she cleaned everything she loved, methodically, thoroughly, and without asking permission. She licked the mud from between his tiny striped ears. She nudged his chin up when he tried to sleep with his face buried too deep in the blanket. When the staff attempted bottle feeding and the cub fussed, Penny would press her side against his and hold perfectly still until he calmed down, her dark eyes fixed on whoever was holding the bottle, watching, evaluating, deciding whether they were doing it right. More than once, her verdict was clearly no. She guarded his food bowl even after he outgrew the bottle, even when the bowl was empty, even when Raja himself had already wandered off. The bowl was the symbol of something, territory, maybe, or commitment, and Penny defended it with the conviction of an animal 3 times her size. The staff started calling them the odd couple within the first week. By the end of the first month, they had stopped calling it odd. Raja's stripes deepened as the weeks passed, and his paws, always slightly too large for the rest of him, began to hint at what was coming. But his brain had already made up its mind about what kind of creature he was, and the evidence was everywhere. He started bringing things. A stick first, then a knotted rope one of the volunteers had left near the enclosure gate, then memorably someone's left boot. He would drop each offering at Penny's feet with the same hopeful, tail-wagging energy she had accidentally taught him, waiting for her reaction the way puppies wait, all eyes, all trembling anticipation. Penny would sniff whatever he'd brought, sometimes approve it with a brief nose bump, sometimes ignore it entirely. Either way, Raja seemed satisfied. The ritual was the point. He tried to sit in laps. This was more complicated, because his idea of a lap and a human lap were not the same size, and by the time he was 8 months old, what he believed was a gentle request had become a 40-pound problem for whoever happened to be sitting on the clinic steps. Staff learned to stand when Raja was nearby. He interpreted this as an invitation to lean. The sound he made instead of roaring was the strangest and most disarming thing about him. It came from somewhere in his chest, a short, breathy, high-pitched yip that rose slightly at the end, like a question. The first time he did it, 3 staff members stopped walking simultaneously and looked at each other. Then they looked at Penny, who did not appear surprised at all. She had, after all, been his only teacher. He yipped when he was hungry. He yipped when Penny came back into view after being out of his sight for too long. He yipped at the butterflies that drifted into the enclosure in the late afternoon, which nobody ever fully got used to. The morning Raja hit 300 pounds, the scale in the clinic broke. Not dramatically, it just gave up quietly, the display blinking twice and going dark, as if it, too, had decided this situation was beyond its job description. Dr. Vanessa stood with her clipboard and looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrote down her estimate and circled it twice. He didn't know he was big. That was the thing nobody outside the sanctuary ever quite believed when they heard the story later, that a 300-pound Bengal tiger could be genuinely, innocently unaware of his own mass. But Raja moved through the world the way Penny had taught him to move through it, with enthusiasm and without self-consciousness. Which is why, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, a game of tag between a poodle and a tiger ended with 40 feet of chain-link fence folded neatly onto the grass like a crumpled piece of foil. He hadn't meant to. He was running. He was always running when Penny ran, because she was fast and he found this thrilling, and he had never once in his life considered that he might be faster. When he pivoted to cut her off near the east corner of the yard, his hindquarters swung wide, and the fence simply wasn't prepared for the argument. The staff alarm went off. Radios crackled. 3 volunteers sprinted across the compound believing the worst. What they found was Penny sitting calmly in the grass, and Raja standing very still beside the collapsed fence section, looking down at it with an expression that, on a smaller animal, would have been described as sheepish. Nobody was hurt. The fence was replaced, but the report was filed and the report was read. And the wheels that nobody wanted to set in motion began, quietly, to turn. The letter from the State Wildlife Board arrived on a Thursday. Dr. Vanessa read it twice, set it down on her desk, and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. The language was careful and bureaucratic and completely without malice, which somehow made it worse. Raja had exceeded the sanctuary's licensed capacity for Class 1 wildlife. His continued residence posed an unacceptable liability. A specialized big cat reserve upstate had been identified as a suitable placement. Transfer was to be arranged within 60 days. 60 days, as if a number that specific made it more manageable. The staff took it hard in the quiet ways people take things hard when they've agreed not to make a scene. Extra time spent in the enclosure, treats that weren't technically on the approved diet. Vanessa started staying an hour later each evening, sitting on the bench near the east fence. The new fence, watching Raja watch the tree line while Penny slept curled against his front leg, her apricot curls rising and falling with his breathing. There was no good argument to make. They had all known, somewhere underneath the joy of it, that this day was built into the story from the beginning. Raja was always going to become something the sanctuary couldn't hold. That had always been true. It just hadn't felt true until the letter. The transport team arrived on a cool October morning with a steel crate large enough to fit a riding lawn mower and patience thin enough that everyone could feel it. Raja saw the crate and stopped moving. He stood at the far end of the enclosure and looked at it with his ears low and his tail still, and no amount of coaxing from the handlers moved him so much as an inch toward it. 40 minutes passed, then an hour. The transport supervisor checked his watch with increasing frequency. It was Vanessa who finally crouched down and unclipped Penny's lead. The little poodle walked the length of the enclosure at her usual unhurried pace, stepped directly into the open crate, turned around and sat down. She looked at Raja. He looked at her. Something passed between them that had no name in any human language. He walked into the crate. The door closed. The handlers moved quickly, gently unhooking the secondary gate, slipping a hand through to guide Penny out. She didn't resist, but she turned back once, just once, as they lifted her clear and latched the crate shut. The truck pulled away slowly, gravel shifting under its tires. Penny stood at the sanctuary gate long after the sound of the engine had faded. She didn't pace. She didn't howl. She just stood there, her small dark nose pressed to the gap in the gate, her eyes fixed on the road, her apricot curls ruffling faintly in the October wind. She stood there until Vanessa came and sat beside her on the ground, and even then she didn't move. Some things you wait for, even when you don't know how long the waiting will last. Time has a way of moving differently depending on which side of the gate you're standing on. At the Big Cat Reserve, Raja grew into himself slowly, the way mountains are made through pressure, through weight, through the accumulation of seasons that reshape without announcing themselves. By his 3rd year, he was 500 pounds of orange and black and absolute silence. The reserve staff noted in their reports that he was healthy, that he ate well, that his coat was exceptional. They also noted, in the careful language of professionals who have learned not to editorialize, that he remained solitary, that he showed no interest in the other tigers, that he spent long hours near the north fence, sitting with his great head turned slightly, as if listening for something just beyond the frequency of the world around him. He never roared. The reserve staff found this unusual. They consulted with veterinary behaviorists, ran tests, found nothing physically wrong. It was simply, as best anyone could determine, a choice. As if the sound had never been installed in him, or had been replaced at some early point with something quieter, something that belonged to a different kind of creature entirely. He still yipped sometimes in the early mornings, soft and brief, barely carrying past the fence line. Nobody at the reserve knew what it meant, but if you had spent any time at a small wildlife sanctuary 300 miles south, you would have recognized it immediately. Back at the sanctuary, the seasons changed the way they always do, indifferently, beautifully, without asking anyone's permission. Penny's apricot curls faded at the edges the way autumn fades, gradually and then all at once, until there was a silver-white ring around her muzzle that hadn't been there the year before. She moved a little more carefully now, taking the clinic steps one at a time instead of bounding up them the way she used to. Her eyes hadn't changed, still dark, still watchful, still carrying that quality of deep, unhurried intelligence that had always made the staff feel they were being assessed rather than observed. She slept with his blanket. That was the thing that undid people who were hearing the story for the first time. Not the big dramatic moments, but that detail. A small, aging poodle curling herself each night into a blanket that had once been shared with a tiger cub, pressing her nose into the fabric as if the scent of something she loved was still held there, still worth finding. Vanessa had tried once to wash it. Penny had looked at her with such deliberate, sustained disappointment that the blanket had been returned unwashed within the hour, and the subject was never raised again. Life at the sanctuary continued. New animals arrived, were healed, were released or relocated. The east fence had been reinforced twice since Raja's departure, a fact that nobody discussed but everyone remembered. His name came up the way the names of beloved things come up sideways in the middle of other sentences, when something reminded you and you couldn't help it. The hurricane had been upgraded to a Category 3 by the time the evacuation order came through for the reserve, and by then the storm had already made the decision for everyone. The sky turned the color of a bruise. The wind came in at angles that didn't make sense. The reserve staff moved fast, loading animals into reinforced transport crates with the focused, controlled urgency of people who have trained for emergencies, and are now hopping the training was enough. the nearest temporary staging facility with the space and infrastructure to hold big cats on short notice, was a wildlife sanctuary 300 miles south. The calls were made. The gates were unlocked. The convoy moved through the driving rain in a line of headlights that stretched a quarter-mile. And by midnight the containment barn at Penny's sanctuary held 6 large crates, and the sound of animals expressing their complete objection to the situation. Raj's crate was at the far end of the barn. Dr. Vanessa stood outside in the rain and listened to the sounds coming from inside and felt something in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Then she did. It was dread. By 2 in the morning, 5 of the 6 cats had settled into an uneasy, exhausted silence. Raja had not. The crate had been rated for animals up to 600 pounds. It had not been designed with the specific combination of 500 pounds and 5 years of accumulated muscle, and a night of lightning and wind, and the smell of flood water, and the deep animal certainty that something was very wrong with the world. The latch failed on the inside panel first. The door followed 20 seconds later with a sound like a gunshot. The barn erupted. The remaining crates rattled as their occupants lurched away from the noise. 3 handlers who had been monitoring from the far entrance backed into the wall, and the one nearest the door grabbed her radio with hands that were not entirely steady and called for backup in a voice stripped clean of everything except information. Raja paced the length of the barn, not with predatory focus, with terror. His ears were flat, his tail rigid, his breath coming in short visible clouds in the cold air. He was not hunting. He was lost, and he was enormous, and he was the most dangerous thing in the room, and the men and women with their tranquilizer rifles trained on him from the upper rail knew that if he charged the crates, if he charged the door, if he made one move they couldn't manage, they were out of options. The supervisor gave the order to hold position. Then he gave it again, because holding position is harder than it sounds when a 500-pound tiger is filling the space between you and the exit. Nobody noticed the small door on the south side of the barn, the one with the latch that had needed replacing for 2 seasons and had never quite made it to the top of the maintenance list. Penny came in low and unhurried, the way she had always moved when she had somewhere specific to be. The handlers saw her at the same moment Raja did. Several things happened simultaneously. At least 2 people said her name, at least one person said something that wasn't a word at all, and every person in that barn stopped breathing in unison. She didn't stop. She crossed the barn floor with her head up and her tail moving in its small, familiar rhythm, her silver-ringed muzzle pointed directly at 500 pounds of panicking apex predator, her paws making the softest sound on the concrete floor, steady and unhesitating and completely without fear. The same way she had walked up to a cardboard box in a storm clinic years ago. The same way she had always walked toward the things she had decided were hers. Raja froze. He had been mid-pace when she entered, all momentum and muscle and cornered animal energy, and the freeze was total, instantaneous, like a film cut. His head dropped, his ears shifted, his nostrils flared once, twice, searching the air with an intensity that pulled every cell of his enormous body into stillness. Then he made a sound. It came from somewhere deep in his chest, soft and brief and rising slightly at the end, barely audible over the rain hammering the barn roof. A small, high sound, a question, an identification. A yip. Penny walked the final 3 feet and pressed her small black nose against the side of his great striped face. Raja folded. There was no other word for it. He went down to his belly the way something enormous goes down when it finally, completely lets go, his legs sliding out beneath him, his chin dropping to the concrete, his eyes closing briefly and then opening again, fixed on the tiny apricot dog now standing 12 inches from his nose. A paw the size of a dinner plate reached out slowly, carefully, and settled around her with a gentleness that seemed physically impossible given the size of the animal producing it. The barn was silent except for the storm. On the upper rail, not a single tranquilizer rifle was still raised. Vanessa was crying. She would deny this later with great conviction, but everyone present agreed on the fact, and nobody blamed her even slightly. It took 11 minutes to get Raja safely secured and the handlers in position, and he allowed every second of it with Penny beside him. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He watched her the way he had always watched her, as if she were the fixed point around which the rest of the world organized itself. Some bonds don't erode with time or distance or the slow weight of years apart. They go underground, maybe. They wait. But they don't break. Penny had known this all along. She had simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. The sanctuary arranged permanent visitation rights 3 weeks later. The paperwork was unusual enough that it required 2 lawyers and a wildlife board member who described the situation as, quote, entirely without precedent, before signing off. Every month, a small apricot poodle makes the drive south in the passenger seat of Dr. Vanessa's truck. And every month at the north fence of a big cat reserve, a 500-pound tiger hears the truck door close and walks, not runs, walks to the fence line and waits. He always yips first. She always ignores it for exactly 3 seconds before trotting over. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be witnessed. If this story moved you, if Penny and Raja reminded you that love doesn't need to make sense to be real, then subscribe to the Wild Samaritan right now. We find these stories so you don't have to miss them. Every time, a new animal, a new miracle, a new reason to believe the world still holds extraordinary things. Don't leave yet. There are more stories waiting, and some of them will change the way you see everything.